my guest today is Yvonne Field, who is the founder of the Ubele Initiative, and a remarkable organization, as I was saying earlier to Yvonne, seems to be perfectly suited to this moment. So I'm going to first start by welcoming Yvonne, and then by asking you to give us a little bit of a sense of what Ubele has done pre the coronavirus pandemic. And I was saying earlier to you that it seems that we have now reached a dividing line in history, which is pre and post the pandemic, and our lives have been changed by it, and the way we describe what we do and what our organizations do in some ways have been changed by it. But in some ways, there's also something core about the original mission and intent of the organizations, which make them particularly relevant to the present. So firstly, welcome. And secondly, tell us a little bit about what the Ubele Initiative does.
Okay, well, thank you, Paul, for inviting me to speak to yourself and your members today. I'm delighted to be here. And I'd like to say particular thanks to Patricia, who suggested that I should be on this platform. So Ubele really developed bottom-up, community-based. It came out of a series of dialogue with Black communities, started in 2011. So it was on a very, very sort of emergent, slow burn listening phase for really a few years, about 2 to 3 years. And when we were listening to what our community said they needed in terms of being more sustainable and to ensure that they had deep roots here in this country, we began to hear some themes emerging. And the reason why I facilitated these conversations and got people together was because my parents came here in the 50s. They are the Windrush generation. They came from Jamaica after the Second World War. And the plan was for many of the people who came at that time was to go home within 5 or 10 years, to return to the Caribbean and Africa. But invariably, you know, life happens. Children come along, people get settled, and that plan sort of, you know, seems to sort of disappear into the ether. And when my mother passed away in 2011, aged 90, we realized that we were 3-4 generations in our family, and that I came to think, well, what's the plan B? If plan A didn't work, we didn't go home, we need a new plan. So that was the genesis of the idea around dialogue, just to listen to what we were saying we needed to do in particular. And a few things came up through those listening exercises. One was around the needs of our young people. What did we need to do for our young people? But also at the other end of the spectrum, it was about the elders and what the elders would need, given that, you know, they were not going home. And further conversations and some research called A Place to Call Home. We started hearing that we were actually losing the older community-based leaders that we had in the 70s and 80s and 90s. They were now 80 plus, basically, 75, 80 plus, and that we needed a new generation of leaders, and that some of those community spaces that they had developed, we actually needed a new model that was much more sustainable, so that we actually had those assets being people and places, predominantly. I mean, there are other assets, obviously, but we felt that we needed a new plan for those community assets to make sure that we had them for future generations. So that was a sort of genesis of Ubele, and A Place to Call Home allowed us to identify a series of recommendations. In fact, we found that women had been and were the community leaders. They weren't necessarily recognized as such, but they were certainly the ones that had run these community spaces and organizations for decades often. And we realized that we needed a next generation. So we developed a series of interventions and initiatives from grassroots, which has led to us supporting organizations to develop their leaders and their community spaces, and also led to us having 2 community spaces that we actively develop. One in Wood Green, which is a 3.5-acre growing and community space called Wolves Lane, and one in Brixton, which was given to the Black community after the uprisings in 1981, called Lloyd Leon Community Centre. So we have kind of 2 grassroots centres that we support their development of. We help other organisations support their spaces. Just before COVID, we became the Black and Minority Ethnic Infrastructure Group for London. So we actually became much more sort of regional And also around just before COVID as well, we became a national strategic partner with Power to Change, and they're the National Group for Community Enterprise. So we're one of their key strategic partners, which actually has meant that we've been doing some work with them during COVID to help support Black and minority ethnic communities. I just lastly say we have 4 strategic objectives now in Ubele. And as I said, we have been very much emergent and to find our space. We registered in 2014 officially as a social enterprise. And our strategic objectives are building sustainable communities, learning and development and creative practice, global diaspora communities, and strategic partnerships. And although we started off as African diaspora, we actually work across the Black and minority ethnic communities around the country.
So it's so self-evident that the infrastructure and the track record and the work that you've done is more relevant today than perhaps any other moment. So tell us what the pandemic has done for your work, the obvious challenges that it has posed for the communities in which you work. I think we can all take for as read, but I think the crucial question is, how do we respond to and build back better with the lens of supporting these particular communities, and how has your work pivoted in this regard?
So, you know, everything happens at a point in time that on reflection, you think, wow, you know, this is very interesting that this got set in place then. So we were appointed, as I said, as a Black and minority ethnic infrastructure group for London in February. Prior to that, there had not been any supported Black and minority ethnic infrastructure group in London. And so London is 40% Black and minority ethnic, but the mayor and the GLA, and it wasn't just the previous mayor, because this has been the situation for at least 10 years, isn't just the current mayor, had not seen it as a priority area of work. So then what happened was, fortunately being appointed in February, we were then able to pivot when COVID hit, and when it was clear that there was a disproportionate impact on our communities. And in fact, I've had COVID. I realized that I had an antibodies test about a month ago, but I actually had gone to Italy just before the lockdown. I went early March for my birthday, came back, and unfortunately I only had a cough. So I thought I might have had it, but I had a cough for a few weeks. And then I had this test and it was confirmed. And I've had a brother in hospital, and I've had other members of my family with COVID. So it's actually had a direct personal and domestic impact, as well as working with the community. We also got a really early heads up that there was an issue in terms of the impact on minority communities, because a colleague of mine, one of his family members is a senior clinician in a London hospital. And she asked the question before the evidence started coming out, you know, what's going on? She was saying 70% of the people on ventilators in her hospital were Black men aged 40 to 60. We were like, And then about 2 weeks later, some of the data started coming up, some of the early data. So that's just kind of putting it in the context that actually it's had a, you know, direct impact, but we kind of had a early heads up about what was happening. So what happened, given that we were appointed in February, we then pivoted to respond to COVID. One of the first things we did was did a piece of research. We looked into, and it is on our website, we looked into the impact, the potential impact on COVID on Black and minority ethnic community organisations in this country. We profiled about 140 organisations, most of them are small and micro, which means they have a turnover of less than £100,000, and many of them had a turnover of actually under £10,000. And the evidence we collected suggested that 9 out of 10 of those organisations would fall apart by the end of last month. Now, I mean, we have heard of closures, because even though there's been some emergency support, those groups are run by volunteers. They were struggling before COVID, and then having to shut down their operations and try and find a way to deliver without much support. It's been very hard. So that piece of research actually has had a real national impact, far beyond what we thought it would have, because it's the only research of its kind that's been done during this period. And so that kind of set a framework for the work that we were doing, because of the kinds of support that groups said they needed. They were obviously support around fundraising and funding applications, around knowing how to redesign their services to be online, in terms of knowing how to outreach to their community, engage them whilst they're actually working remotely. A whole host of issues came up, which we've been able to support and advise on. We run weekly webinars, for example, on funding, different funding schemes, give one-to-one support, and so on. So there's been a whole big piece that we've been involved in terms of research. We're actually just almost completed another piece of research, 2 other pieces of research. One's been completed, not yet launched, which is about the mental health impact on Black and minority ethnic communities during COVID. And then the second piece of research that we're not quite finished, but that'll be finished by end of next month, is a rapid review of all the research that's been done around COVID-19, and not just BME communities, but those with protected characteristics. We're working with University of Manchester and Sussex on that piece of research for London, looking at the London situation. So there's been research, there's been practical support, hand-holding in some cases, problem solving, sort of people ring us or email us and ask, what should we do? How do we respond to this? But also, we've actually got involved in campaigning. The reason why we've got involved in campaigning, and although we are an organisation that facilitates change and development, we felt there was a particular voice that wasn't being heard and noticed. Given the disproportionate impact of COVID on Black and minority ethnic communities, we felt that actually the government needed to provide some answers about what was going on. I think I didn't hear the news, but they've been reported to me several times that late last week, early over the weekend, Boris Johnson at least admitted that basically the government had not, responded in the way that they could have. I mean, that's a sort of, well, we won't say what that is, but we felt that actually the response was so poor. And actually, in some cases, and this is why we're looking at taking this case to court, in fact, it was a dereliction of duty, because under the Equalities Act 2010, when the government knew the disproportionate impact of COVID, they should have at least been really clear about how they were assessing risk to the communities. We know that the NHS are supposed to be assessing risk of their staff. And a few weeks ago, the evidence suggested only 25% of BME staff in hospitals had been risk assessed by their employers. But actually, there's a major piece of work the government has not done that actually we felt that we should challenge them. It started with me doing a petition on 38 degrees. It's still there. It's got over 30,000 signatures. Then we produced an open letter, which now has got over 800 signatures that was gone to the Prime Minister. They didn't respond. We wrote again. They didn't respond. So we sent them a pre-court action letter with support by Lee Day solicitors, who have been phenomenal. And we set up this Crowd Justice Fund on the Crowd Justice Fund page to help us with legal fees if we get to the situation where we actually go into court, taking the government to court. So it's, as I said, it's been fundraising, research, practical advice, advocacy, campaigning. And then the last piece that we've been two other pieces we've been involved in since COVID. One, because we're about building strategic partnerships as well as sustainable communities, the mental health impact, we know is huge, and it's going to actually unfold and get worse over the coming year or so. So some colleagues approached us because we incubate new ideas. We help others build their ideas. So they asked us if we would host an initiative that's beginning to grow called, it's got 3 parts to it. It's called BAME Stream, which is a group of Black and minority ethnic therapists and counsellors who are coming together to provide therapy services for the community, by the community. Because after Grenfell, a lot of Black and minority ethnic therapists weren't able to get into Grenfell because some of the white-led organisations came in and they kind of, they took over, and they weren't able to provide culturally sensitive services. So this is in response to that, BAME Stream. They've produced the research that I've mentioned that's coming out shortly. Then secondly, linked to this, and these 3 pieces are linked all around mental health, there's a group of technical sort of people, creatives as well, who are building a platform called Auntie, Your Auntie. And in our community, our aunties are very important to us. They can either be your biggest advocates or your biggest nightmares, but hopefully this auntie platform will be an advocate. And it's an acronym for advice, understanding, nuanced therapies in emergencies. So that's going to be the platform that mainstream services will be accessed through. And the last piece is the Majonzi Bereavement Fund. Majonzi means grief or deep sorrow in Swahili. And it's to provide access to pay for some of the therapy that people will access through mainstream and your auntie, as well as when the time comes, i.e. hopefully next year, people want to actually remember their loved ones that have passed away, that will give small grants to them through Majonzi Fund for memorials, because they're going to need for people to remember their loved ones, once they've actually come to terms with what's happened. So mainstream and your auntie and the Majonzi Fund are sort of new, innovative initiatives that we've been designing.
Extraordinary, just creativity and energy, and it's remarkable. So I want to ask to go back a little bit, because there's so much to dig into here. So your litigation under the Equalities Act, what is your ask? What's your remedy? What is it that if you win, what do you get?
Okay, good question, thanks. So the ask is for an independent public inquiry. Now I know the government's announced an inquiry recently, the last couple of weeks, but actually we want a root and branch investigation into what really happened. About 6 weeks ago, I think the Sunday Times produced a huge piece about the first 30 odd days or so that what had happened during COVID in the government, and it was just explosive. I mean, it just felt like that the government didn't actually care about the people. And so we're asking for an independent public inquiry to look at why has there been a disproportionate impact on Black and minority ethnic communities, and what could have the government done under the Equalities Act to try and mitigate against some of it, yes? I mean, the thing is, we know that inquiries are limited, they're resource intensive. I know, we know all the flaws, but within what we were able to sort of put forward as a proposition and as an ask, we felt that would allow us, because actually, under the Human Rights Act, it's not just under the Equalities Act, but there's also something under the Human Rights Act, which is a right to life. Yeah, and so we're also, challenging them about the fact that actually they've not secured the right to life for our people in this country. They've actually allowed people to die, and actually, because in 2016 there was a scenario planning exercise, 2016, which looked at what would happen if there was a pandemic in this country. All the resources were put into that scenario planning exercise. All the recommendations came up and showed that the government would not be able to cope with its current capacity. The health system would crash. They had all the recommendations, and then Brexit happened. So that was swept aside for Brexit. And so it's not as though they didn't know that this potential of this was happening and that they'd have a major systemic failure. And they actually did not do anything to actually mitigate against that.
So I want to just drill down for a moment on this question of a major systemic failure, because in some ways, and forgive me for a South Africa analogy, but it may be apt. I mean, I think one of the challenges in the anti-apartheid struggle was white South Africans, in some instance, had such a high degree of willful and intentional ignorance about apartheid. Firstly, because they were beneficiaries from it, but secondly, because it just didn't even enter into their imaginative horizon what apartheid was like, because they didn't see or experience any part of the lived experience of Black South Africans. Townships were something far away. Mm-hmm. Black South Africans appeared to them in neatly ironed uniforms, mm-hmm. working in their homes, and then they magically appeared and magically disappeared. but the horror, the brutality, the inequality, the deprivation, the violence was literally out of their imagination and out of their vision. And I think if you think back to the beginnings of the pandemic, there's something of that as well, but you could not have not responded quicker and could not have seen the disparate impact on communities of color. You could only not have acted if those communities were not in your imagination, were not in your lived experience, were not in your sense of your political and social sense of empathy. And that may be a kind of cheap, somewhat psychological explanation for it, and I'm sure there are many others, but I'm curious as to whether you think there's a grain of truth in that in this setting as well.
Look, I think, Paul, is there a grain of truth in that? There might be half a grain of truth in that, right? However, even when Public Health England produced quite early research about what was going on, they decided not to include the community voice in that first cohort of that first study that came out. Even if you go back to May, which is when that happened, right? You know, it's like, why did they silence us? What was it that was going on that they felt that they didn't want the general public to hear, you know, and to actually understand the enormity of the disproportionality and the horror of it all? So, you know, they were not only, it was not only within their circle of, you know, kind of their normal circle of who comes to, well, we weren't having barbecues there, but the people they hang out with, that go on holiday with, or that they're in their normal friendship and social networks, right? That we weren't there, we're not there. It's clear that we're not there to any significant degree. But actually, you know, okay, you can argue about data and, you know, what it tells, it might tell half the story or whatever, but there was a story emerging fairly early on. The first 12 doctors that died were from Black and minority ethnic communities. That iconic photograph of those faces that The Guardian produced that then kind of has become to sort of personify what's been happening. It feels like every opportunity they had to look and to notice and to act, they almost like, well, not almost, I feel that they turned the other way. They sort of just turned away from it, because probably it was like, nobody went looking for, Black people and people of color did not go looking for COVID to impact them, you know, and it's like, we're all in shock and horrified and in disbelief on one level, although we know about the inequalities that we experience systemically for decades. So again, it's no real surprise. But actually, I think for the government, who are supposed, you know, we all pay taxes, we keep them in their jobs. They're there to support and lead the people and to create sort of, you know, to allow us to thrive in this society. Once they were aware, you know, then what did they do? They still continue to do nothing. And that for us is unacceptable. And I think that, you know, when you, I mean, you know, the conversation we had before, just before we started, I mean, I've spent a lot of time in South Africa. Basically, I've had a parallel life there as well, you know, since 95. So I understand absolutely that complete, you know, yeah, apart by but separate kind of way of living, you know, and it's like, yeah, you could be on 2 different planets, at least maybe 3 even, or 4, given the complexity of South Africa, but worlds apart. So I understand that. But actually, you know, Boris Johnson claims to have the most ethnically diverse government in place at this moment in time. So what were his colleagues who were sitting around the table with him as either as senior leadership in the cabinet or as advisors? I know they've got advisors from minority communities in Downing Street and in other parts of the cabinet. So what were they saying? Because I'm assuming that their families were also being impacted. Yeah, and so again, it's like how much, what needs to happen? Well, maybe Black Lives needed to happen. Black Lives Matter needed to happen for the government to wake up and to kind of just listen to people and to notice what's happened, what needs to happen, to notice what's happening. And I think that's a sort of challenge that we need to make, that we're trying to make to them. And we know these things can take years and years and years. We know that. And we are also looking for some potential early wins. Where can we get some kind of, you know, judicial reviews. And I'm, you know, so not a legal person. That's why we're so heavily reliant on Lead Aid. And we've got an awesome group of young leaders who have been doing some of the, you know, kind of research and talking to people in the community and doing all the social media around this campaign. Because, you know, it's important that, you know, we're an intergenerational organisation, so we'll always work across the 3 or 4 generations in Ubele. But they've just been awesome in terms of getting the message out there. And they had a session on the independent public inquiry, police brutality, Black Lives Matter, because we've been also having emergency conversations since early April onwards. We've had a series of conversations. We talked about test and trace, very controversial, but we need to think, what does it mean for our communities? We've been talking about the impact on business, and we've also had some work that Pat and other colleagues have been leading, trying to take the banks to task, because there's all this new money that's been available, even though there's no such thing as if we don't have a money tree in this country, but we've got all this new money coming to the system over the past 4 months, and actually still Black businesses and minority businesses are not accessing that, able to access those resources to keep their businesses afloat and to ensure they have livelihoods. So yeah, I've just gone slightly off track, but actually I think that the government, you know, I mean, I've as a child, I was homeschooled because the school that we applied for didn't take me. And there was a racial issue at the core of it, actually. My 5 white friends got into the school. They said they wanted to attend with me, and I didn't get in. My mother was asked if she was a British citizen and had a British passport at the interview for the school, and we didn't get in, and there wasn't any choice really left afterwards. So I learned at 11 and 12 that you could campaign, because we waged a campaign with the local education authority, and I was homeschooled with Black activists in our living room when I was 11, which was many, many, many decades ago. But actually it just taught me that you can push back the system, you know, sometimes single-handedly, but preferably with a group of committed individuals. That helps. And now that we've got social media and we've got, you know, we've also got spaciousness at the moment. I mean, yes, people are working incredibly hard, but actually there's much more flexibility in how you work at the moment. That means you can galvanize a voice, you know, and raise a voice in a way that if we were all in our little offices, it would be a little bit more difficult to do.
Yvonne, let me ask you just about the state, because it's hearing you speak is a personification of the power of community organization led by, responsive to, accountable to the communities that it serves. And having, you know, lived the vast majority of my life in South Africa, having also spent some time in the US, and having looked at the kind of architecture of community-based organizations advocating for justice in race terms, in human rights terms, at a community level, dealing with inequality and poverty, where do you put the UK in terms of its infrastructure and the strength of its organizations? Because I think that's sort of the key guarantor for justice to be done is the work that you're doing. Innovation, campaigning, problem solving, not lying down when there's an injustice, using all of the legal strategies available to you, plus doing positive solutions like your mental health work. It seems to me we need hundreds of you, thousands of you. So give us a sense of how strong you think the sector is, and how much more we could be doing.
Yeah, so I mean, pre-COVID, the sector had been absolutely stripped away in terms of infrastructure support over the last 10 years since we've had austerity. Yeah, and COVID, I mean, you know, organizations like ours, many organizations that are providing infrastructure support have been saying this, particularly to funders, foundations, governments, and so on that have resources. And actually, it's completely fallen on deaf ears before COVID. Absolutely. The funding that was available for community-based initiatives were often project by project based. So you build your little project for a year, if you're lucky 2 years, if you're very, very lucky 3 years, and you'd build your staffing team, and you'd have a little bit of overhead costs to sort of try and keep your lights on literally and your phones on. And that was a state of play for at least 10 years. COVID exposed that. I mean, absolutely fundamentally expose the lack of infrastructure and the need for infrastructure. And organizations like Charity So White, they made a major intervention. They came into being, I think, about last November, again, when I talk about timing, and they made a major intervention in April as COVID hit to actually really, really push the charitable funding sector to support. Their original ask was for at least 20% of emergency funds to go to Black and minority ethnic community organizations. And but what they've really opened up is a whole conversation about equity of funding. And the sort of net impact of that has been that funders now, of course, have had to pivot funding, be really flexible, kind of, reduce the bureaucracy, do a whole raft of things. But also what it's brought on the table is about the need for infrastructure, properly resourced long-term infrastructure, as well as about equity of funding decisions. So what's happened is now the lottery, because they're the biggest funders, they give away about, I think it's about 600 million a year or so, maybe even more. Particularly for the Black and minority ethnic infrastructure organisations, because there are some out of London. I mean, again, when you talk about how have you done that, it's been very entrepreneurial. Most of them are social enterprises. They've sort of sold services. They've got commission to do delivery of services. They've not got core grants to pay for a team of staff. Yeah, they've just not had that. So, but what we were able to do at Ubele is bring together those groups in Lancashire, Bristol, Manchester, Birmingham. We only have, apart from ourselves, there's one local infrastructure group that's Black and minority ethnic led in Croydon. And so we brought all those groups together to try and influence the lottery and other funders around infrastructure support. And actually, that decision has been taken across the piece. There's lots of strategic groups working together now around funding, and infrastructure and core support and core costs for that infrastructure is back on the table. It's unbelievable. We're just going, well, we'll just see how this pans out. We'll see how long it lasts for. We'll see what the real intentions are here. But actually, they are so up for having the conversation and recognizing that we were literally left naked as a sector with the lack of infrastructure, and that we've just had to cobble things together over the past 10 years. And it's just, it's not sustainable. Of course it's not. We told them so. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it seems, if there is a silver lining to emerge from this extraordinarily dark and difficult and unjust period, it is that it reawakens the need for community-led organizations to just sprout, to be supported, and for whose infrastructure to be funded would be essential. So I have a question from Patricia, who so kindly introduced you. She says, do you think it's possible that the government's race inequality review led by Munira Mirza will deliver a fair and independent assessment? What does it need to have in place to win the community's trust and deliver recommendations that will actually be enacted and not like so many past reviews?
Wow. I think the reaction, I think the overwhelming reaction to the appointment of the lead for the review and just for the people that are on it, I'm sorry, the overarching reaction has been quite negative, actually, and I'm unfortunately on the side of negativity. I'm not convinced that they have the right people around the table, because when people come around the table, my question is, who are you actually accountable to? Where are you actually taking your evidence from? Because if it's from your own lived experience, which there will be a story there, but actually sometimes it can be quite divorced from the reality of the communities. So we know, as Patricia says, the range of reviews that have happened in the past in terms of the impact. I mean, we had the race disparity audit in 2017 that David Lammy and Lord Simon Woolley were involved in. What's happened to that? It's just sort of like a damp squib, apparently. I mean, not apparently, I mean, it's just not got legs. So what's going to make it different this time? I really don't know. And I also think, I mean, linked to who they're taking their mandate from, where is the community voice in this? Often like these very high level strategic and policy-driven initiatives, just there's a massive gap in the middle, and that actually it's almost like there's a sort of fear of talking to the community because you might hear things you don't really want to hear, and it might present you with challenges that you really don't want to address. So I'm highly skeptical about this. In fact, even if there's a conversation about how should we do this, what might this look for, how can we bring our greatest creativity to this, actually, given that we are, that we've really got, a wicked problem here. We've got something that we've been trying to grapple with for the past 70 years, actually. And it felt like this thing was just announced, this commission. You're like, oh, here we go again. So I'm, very skeptical, as you can hear. I can't remember the second part of the question, but I know there was a second part. But actually, I just feel like we have to do better than this because we've been around this pony track many times before with very little transformational change. Well, with very little change, long-term transformational change. It's just,
So it's links to the second part of the question, but it's also sort of a kind of note to end on because our 40 minutes has galloped past. But I want to, if you were to lead such a commission and you were to have it with the kind of a chosen group of people who genuinely came from the community, represented the community, had the community's best interests, and had to write 2 or 3 headline recommendations. And I know it's a very hard thing to ask you to do, but so that it isn't an exercise in window dressing. So it isn't one of these things that comes and goes and becomes a damp squib. What are the sorts of structural changes that you think need to be done that will lead to ongoing real change as opposed to just patching up a crisis and then going back to the status quo ante?
Yeah. Wow. Well, maybe you've got a hidden agenda here, Paul. Maybe you're going to get me to do such a piece of work or us to do afterwards because I'm like, how do I do this? But I think there's something about long-term investment, a strategy for 30 years. Come on, let's do a generation here. Let's not talk about even 5 or 10 years, right? And because Ubele is taken from Swahili to mean the future, right? This, Black and minority ethnic communities don't get included in future thinking. I mean, we're a majority in Leicester. We're going to be at least 45% in Birmingham shortly. We're 40% plus in London. So we are a major, constituency to be considered. So what are our needs? We've got lots of data. We've got lots of data around health, education, social care, housing, employment. But actually that data, it's like we're not using it to create this 30-year strategy that I think we need to create. So for me, there's something about that. It has to be intergenerational. It has to include those young people who are going to be here and lead in 30 years' time. So let's start with the 14 to 16-year-old age group to be involved in this. And actually, let's start with the children. But it has to be held intergenerationally, and we have to use the best of our creativity. Forget these high levels talking shops. That can be an outcome and an output from this process in terms of creating the kinds of documents that we need. And it needs to include the best of our talent. We've got awesome people in our communities at all levels, in all sectors. But actually, we can't often see ourselves because it's quite dispersed and quite hidden. I just heard this morning, someone sent me a Guardian article about a Black woman who's been in the Formula One field for 30 years. And she's like, she runs the whole of one Formula One site. Now, I'm not saying that she should or should be part of the thinking, but her insights in a very, very white male-dominated field, could really bring something quite special. So community wealth building, a 30-year strategy for community wealth building is what I would be suggesting, and that we bring the best of our brains, our creativity across the age groups to help shape that and to own it. Because at the end of the day, like with the messaging we're getting from the government, people don't understand what's going on. They don't know what the messaging is around coronavirus at the moment and COVID-19, what to do, how to do it. It just changes every 5 minutes. So there needs to be a way of building long-term ownership of the vision.
I love that final formulation, and I find it deeply compelling, a 30-year strategy of community wealth building, because I think what it speaks to is real change, structural change, a shift in power, a shift in resources, but also a shift in autonomy, and enabling a community to be able to determine its own future based on dignity and based on, dare I say it, the wealth that would have accrued had past injustices not occurred, and if they had been properly remedied when they had occurred. So I think that's a wonderful note to end, and it's certainly very helpful for my thinking and for our thinking at the Conduit. And we definitely would love you to come back, definitely do an insight piece for our community to help shape this. And I think the infrastructure and the leadership you represent will be vital to having these issues addressed in the future. So for that, we are incredibly grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much for having me. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
All right, everybody. Stay safe and stay well. See you soon. Bye.
Bye.